Hey folks, back with another video. This one is somewhat of a follow-up to a video that I posted a couple days ago, which I'll link into the description. You don't have to watch that video if you've not seen it, but I wanted to respond to a comment that someone left on that previous video. The comment was to ask, okay, well, where do we go from here? What do we do now? And specifically, what would Jesus tell us to do? And I just want to share that. First of all, I really appreciated that comment. So to the person who left it, thank you. But I felt like those questions were very appropriate questions to ask, very understanding questions to ask. Because if we're really opening our eyes to the way things are in this modern world, if we're seeing things for how they really are, and we're not living in lies and deceit and deceptions, and we're not numbing ourselves, we're not, just addicted to all of the offerings of the world just to kind of like distract ourselves and not pay attention to what's going on. Instead of doing those things, we are really seeing things clearly, really seeing what's happening in our world today with a clear set of eyes and hearts that have been convicted towards the truth. So if we're doing that and we're seeing things for what they really are, this person's questions were like, okay, well, what do we do now? Where do we go from here? And what specifically would Jesus command us to do from here? And I felt like coming on here and saying, I have no idea. I really don't. So I just want to offer that caveat. Before I say anything else, these are open questions that I hope all of us can have the courage to hold for ourselves in our own lives. They're not going to be a one-size-fits-all sort of answer to these types of questions. What you do with this awareness and this understanding might look a lot different than what I do with this awareness and understanding. Certainly, if we're being led by the Holy Spirit, we're all going to be led in different and unique ways because we're different and unique people with unique gifts, unique callings, and unique convictions on our lives and what we're meant to do with our lives. I did feel a certain conviction in reading that person's comments on the previous video to try to personalize those questions as much as I could. So the questions are, where do we go from here? What are we supposed to do now? What would Jesus tell us to do in these modern times that we're living in? And I felt like a certain level of appropriateness in my own process around holding questions like that. I felt that it would be appropriate to maybe not get too caught up in the collective aspect of those questions, because I could sit here, okay, well, here's what we need to do. We need to get out in the streets. We need to form, resistance, bands of resistance, and we need to, write our congressmen. And like, I could start, let's say, prescribing what I think could be potential collective responses to those questions. But where I felt the conviction was most alive for me was to try to personalize these questions, to try to say, instead of me having any kind of answers at all of where do we go from here, can I find the courage to ask the question of, okay, where do I go from here? And that's a much scarier question to ask because it implies a much higher level of personal responsibility and individual sovereignty. It's a little bit easier, I think, to start talking about what should we do. And we can sit around and be like, oh, well, we should do this and we should do that. But that can be actually a way of diffusing one's responsibility over one's life. And we can sit here and say, we should do this, we should do that. And it's a way of allowing ourselves to feel like we're a part of something or that we're doing something. But very often what happens when we have more of a collective-minded approach to things is that typically nothing really happens. So we can say, we need to do this and we need to do that. And it's kind of a way of making ourselves feel better a lot of the times without necessarily driving a lot of action or driving a lot of outcomes. It gets to be a little bit more of an uncomfortable situation when the questions become internalized inward. This is what I'm experiencing in my own process. When I internalize these questions of, okay, well, what do I do now? Where do I go from here? How does Jesus want me to live? in the presence of this type of awareness to the truth that is present. When we reframe it like this, the questions become a little bit harder to sit with, and not necessarily any clear answers emerge right away. I think what I wanted to encourage as much as anything is that we should do our best, to the extent that we can, to not necessarily expect the answers that we're seeking to emerge in the collective. I think this is a trap that we fall for. We fall into the trap of thinking that the answers to what we're looking for are going to appear out there. This is why people tend to fall into cults of following certain charismatic leaders. It could be anybody. It could be a certain presidential candidate. It could be a YouTube personality. It could be anything where we start to think that out there is a representative for what we want to see happen in the world, and all we really have to do is sort of fall in line and just hope that good things will happen, because the out there person is on it, you know? I would invite us to stop doing this. I would invite us to stop thinking that the sorts of emerging movements and emerging collective human behaviors that maybe we hope to see happen in the world, let's stop hoping to see it happen out there so that we can kind of like sit back and observe it and cheer it on and say, yay, you know, the thing that I'm rooting for in my heart is now happening outside of myself over there. And so, hey, lo and behold, maybe I don't have to do very much. Maybe I can just kind of sit here and celebrate the fact that things seem to be moving in the direction that I would want them to be moving in. That is legitimate to a certain extent. Obviously, there are things that are going to be happening in this world that we can, that are cause for celebration. We can take a position. We can take a side. We can say, you know, I like that this over here is happening, and I'm glad that this over here is not happening any longer. Certainly, we can have these sorts of preferences and biases in terms of what we see going on in the world. But really what it comes down to fundamentally is, are we able to hold a level of responsibility over our own life where we're not necessarily hoping for something to happen outside of ourselves that is going to be what leads to our ultimate satisfaction in this world? So on the topic, the last video was specifically talking about the upcoming US election and how, you know, my position and my encouragement to other people, specifically Americans in this case, who have the right to vote in the upcoming US election, my position on it is that we should not participate in the process of choosing one of these two major party candidates of who we want to be, you know, ostensibly leading us, even though we don't have to see these people as being our leader. We don't have to look at the president in the US and regard that person as having any kind of authority over our lives, especially when that authority is corrupted and illegitimate, especially when their interests and who they're serving are principalities of darkness and evil and destruction and war. They're not really, we've sort of bought into this lie that they are representing us, you know, this idea that we live in a representative democracy and that our elected officials, oh, well, they answer to us, you know, the taxpayer. I pay my taxes, and so they have to answer to what I think. That is like, that world has been long gone for a very long time. These corrupted officials that we see, both elected and unelected, in Washington, in the government of the United States, they do not represent the American people. They represent a wealthy billionaire donor class, first and foremost, and they represent the interests of that wealthy billionaire donor class, which tend to be interests that, lo and behold, just so happen to align with doctrines of Jewish supremacy, Zionism, the idea that certain people in the Middle East who are colonizing land, who are stealing land, killing Palestinian bodies, and destroying communities and the welfare of other people. Where have we seen this steal, kill, and destroy ideology before? It's in the Bible. We're told in the Bible that Satan, the enemy of humanity, the enemy of Christ, the enemy of all that is good and true and holy and pure, he seeks, what does he seek to do? He seeks to steal, kill, and destroy. And if we look at what is taking place in Israel today, we see that there are human beings who are operating under effectively the operating system of steal, kill, and destroy. It's a steal, kill, and destroy society. So in that sense, it's a demonic society. It's a satanic society. And the supposed leaders of the United States, the elected leaders, the U.S. government, the whole apparatus of Washington in general, has pretty much, not entirely, thank God not entirely, but it's been mostly, I would argue, taken over by agents of Satan in this case, agents of Zionism, who they don't represent you, the American taxpayer. They don't care about you. That's what the point I was making in my last video. These people, they don't care about you, okay? We have to understand that. Our elected officials don't care about us. We're not who they serve. Who they serve are wealthy billionaire donors, and who those wealthy billionaire donors serve, in effect, is this doctrine of Zionism, this doctrine of conquest and expansion, this doctrine of destruction, this doctrine that rather than love thy neighbor, which is what we're taught in the Bible, this is Christ's command on our lives, his greatest command, his only command, arguably, is love one another. Love one another. Love thy neighbor as thyself. So this is our starting point right here in our hearts with everything that we do in our lives. And so when we're asking the question of how does Jesus want us to live, what would Jesus have us do? I don't know. I can't prescribe a general response to that, except just to say that we want to come right here into our hearts and recognize that the command that he placed on our lives is that we love each other and we love our neighbors as ourselves. So that's our starting point. That's our first principle. That's what we come back to when we're feeling a little unsure, when we're feeling a little lost, when we don't know what to do next. We need to come back to our hearts and remember that the way that we've been called to live is to love our neighbor as ourselves. And my invitation to you would be to try to see all of humanity as your neighbor. You know, you have a physical neighbor. Mine is right on the other side of that red fence right there. I have a neighbor, a physical neighbor. But I want to see all of humanity as my neighbor ultimately. Ultimately, anyone who's alive on this earth in a human body is in some way, shape, or form the neighbor that Christ is calling me to love. So, you know, this is a major calling. It's enough of a calling that if all we really did was just focus on trying to live up to that calling in our lives, we would have our hands full. We have plenty of work to do. I'm not very loving to my neighbors, unfortunately. I'm not necessarily a monster to my neighbors either, I hope, you know, but in terms of room for improvement, I know that I can be way more loving to my neighbors and humankind in general. And this is where we want to start. This is how we want to begin or continue the process of claiming our souls back from these evil demons that are running amok and ruling on our planet. We have strength in numbers. That's the best thing we have going for us. The best thing we have going for us is these principalities of darkness that have a tremendous amount of influence and power on our planet today. They're not actually that strong in number. The only reason they have the success that they appear to be having, and they are having, is that most of humanity is asleep. Most of humanity is distracted, deceived, led into sin, led into addiction, led into temptation, led into all manners of various deceptions, propaganda, lies, deceit. Pretty much the majority of humanity is in some way, shape, or form asleep at the wheel of the calling of their soul's mission, the calling that God puts on our lives, which is to fight the good fight. Fight the good fight. Most people, myself included, we're not engaged in the active process of fighting the good fight 24/7. In my case, I don't feel like I'm really engaged in it necessarily very often, unfortunately. A lot of times I'm a little bit more wrapped up in just trying to meet my basic needs, just trying to do what I've got to do to survive. Like, this is a struggle that a lot of us find ourselves in, right? There's bills to pay, there's mouths to feed, there's stuff that needs to be taken care of. Like, a lot of our lives are somewhat given over to this, I would say, somewhat unfortunate and yet also necessary process of just kind of trying to figure out how to just keep going, just get through the day, get through the week, get through the month, and yeah, just manage to continue maintaining our human lives. So while a lot of our lives are given over to that, we want to remember that ultimately the calling on our soul is to live fearlessly, to live for Christ, to live with a heart that is on fire, that has a real passion of the heart for the cause of love, for the cause of liberating the human soul from this tug of war that exists for the human soul on this planet. The human soul is being fought over in the unseen realms. That means your soul, my soul, and just the collective soul of humanity, the soul of this species. There's a war being waged for that soul. One of my favorite verses, Ephesians 6:12, I think it is. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but the principalities of darkness and the powers of the spiritual world, the spiritual realm. What that is saying is that there is an eternal battle of good versus evil, and the prize being fought for is your soul and my soul, the human soul, all of our souls is being fought for. I would argue that when I look around today, I think that the dark side is winning. That's my official assessment, my official report. I think darkness is winning on this planet today. I think that in general, there are not enough people who are fighting the good fight, who are standing up for the cause of Christ, the cause of human liberation from lies, sin, deceit, deceptions, satanic distortions. We see this problem in the church as much as anywhere else. The church is completely asleep at the wheel. If you go into any church anywhere in America on any given Sunday, you're not going to hear a single word uttered about the plight of the Palestinian people. You're not going to hear a single word uttered about the fact that Israel, which the church seems to support, is implicitly anti-Christ on account of the fact that they are steal, kill, and destroying their neighbor. The church has mostly been deceived. The church has been lied to. The church has been programmed to go along with these doctrines of Satanism out of the belief that, it's all just this necessary process that needs to happen in order for the end times prophecies to be ushered in. There may or may not be truth to that, but one thing I know is true is that we have a calling on our lives, which is to fight the good fight and to stand up for the oppressed, to stand up for those who are being destroyed by forces of evil, by Satan, by darkness, by principalities of darkness, by warmongers, by liars, by thieves. We ought to be standing up in resistance to those forces, come what may. Let God judge us. Let God judge me. If if I'm way wrong about everything I'm saying, God will deal with me, and I accept that judgment that hey, I have to answer for what I've done in this life. I accept that. We all should be looking at ourselves in the mirror these days and wondering, why is it that as a society, as a collective, as if you're from the US, if you're American, why is it as a country that we lack the moral will to do anything about the fact that our government is supporting a genocide? This is a very, very, very dark period of American history that we're living through right now. Arguably, much of American history is quite dark. I'm not going to sit here and say that we're a blameless country or that we're a force for good in the world or anything like that necessarily. I don't really believe in that sort of mythology. I don't really think that the historical record supports it very much. But I do think that there's a lot of good about our country, about the United States specifically. I think that there is something potentially very redeemable about it, and that if it can be functioning at its best, if it can be operating at its best as a nation, it can be a tremendous force for good in the world. It can be a wonderful influence to humanity at large. And I think it has been that in some ways, shapes, and forms throughout history. I think that today we see a United States that is unfortunately probably doing more harm than good in the world today. As evidenced by the fact that we are essentially the only country that is enabling and supporting and allowing for 2,000-pound bombs to be dropped on tents that have refugees in them. There's a satanic agenda playing out in the world today that is destroying innocent people. And unfortunately, if you're an American, or if you're a U.S. citizen, our government is, I would argue, chiefly responsible for that particular genocide. So this is not an easy pill to swallow. This is a very inconvenient truth that most people don't want to pay any attention to. As I said in the previous video, in November, there's going to be tens of millions of people heading to the polls to cast their vote, and 95% or more of those votes are going to be cast for one of two candidates, both of whom are pro-genocide, pro-Israel, and therefore pro-genocide. They are bought and paid for. They are compromised. These are agents of a Zionist regime. They don't represent you. You have only just been tricked into thinking that they represent you. Who they represent are billionaire donors that want to see certain agendas play out on this planet that are satanic. I'm sorry to say, but that's just what it is. These folks are compromised. They don't deserve our vote. We should be rising up in resistance to this two-party system that tells us that these are our only options. These are our only options. One of these two candidates, choose one. If you fall for that trap, you are submitting yourself over to this system that is a demonic, militarized, violent war crime system. And we should try not to do that. We should try to do anything else other than that. So to wrap this video up, in response to the question that the brother left, where do we go from here? What are we supposed to do now? My response is basically do anything other than participate in this particular two-party system that is complicit in genocide and wants to just continue to endorse and supply weapons all around the world for people to be murdered unjustly. We can do better than that, especially if we're believers, if we're followers of Christ. We should not get caught participating in this beast system as believers. The last place that you want Christ to find you on his return is in a voting booth while you're voting for one of these two major party presidential candidates. I urge you to choose any other option than that. You can choose a third party candidate. There's a couple of good ones, at least ones who are anti-genocide that deserve more attention than they get. They don't get any attention in the mainstream media in the United States because the mainstream media in the United States is completely controlled by these Zionist foreign agents that want to keep everybody dumbed down, blind, anesthetized, in the dark, unaware of what's really going on, so that these war crimes can continue to be committed without a population in the United States that is rising up to stop it from happening. We don't have that right now. I don't think that we're going to have that between now and the election. So in terms of what do we do and where do we go from here, I urge you to continue living from your heart and to continue believing that the choices that you make matter. It might not seem like they matter. You might have adopted the belief that they just don't matter. It doesn't matter what I do. What you do matters. You may or may not have children. I have a daughter. We ought to live our lives in a way such that if our children ever come around questioning who their parents were or what their parents stood for or what were their parents doing while the U.S. government was enabling genocide against the Palestinian people, we ought to be able to answer for that in a way that we can live with. And I'll tell you now that if our children someday realize that we were voting for one of these pro-genocide, compromised presidential candidates who are probably being controlled by some form of blackmail, who are probably, they're probably not free beings themselves. I don't think that they are. I don't think either one of them are. I think they're under the control of very powerful forces that unfortunately do not have you or my best interest in mind. We ought to, at the very least, be able to let our children know that we at least did not support that two-party system that was marching in lockstep with the appearance of differences and separation, but marching in lockstep in its full unconditional support of a murderous satanic regime in the Middle East. We need to stop our support of that. If we're in the church, we need to come out of the church and stop filling up the offering basket every week with our tithing. That just enables more of these deceptions to be carried forward into perpetuity. While Christians, supposed Christians, supposed followers of Christ, do nothing about the oppressed and the persecuted people who are being destroyed and murdered by their neighbors rather than loved. So, there's a lot of work here to do. The humanity is in a really ugly spot. The American public is in an extremely ugly spot. We're living in a very, very, very dark time in the collective history of not only the world, but more specifically the United States. We don't really have any leadership. Our government has been completely taken over by foreign agents that don't represent us. We're supposed to be a government by the people, for the people. We're a government by special interests for the so-called security of a foreign nation. It's a cancer. It's pretty much completely spread throughout all of the federal government in Washington. We're at like stage 4 terminal illness here. We need heavy amounts, I'm sorry to say, of chemotherapy, which is going to look like you functioning as a white blood cell that rises up and says, I'm not going to participate in this. Try to be a part of the immune system here. Try to be a part of the solution here. Don't just simply go along with this and just say that this is what we get. This is all we get. This is just what it is. It's one of these two choices, and there's nothing we can do about it, and we just have to kind of just go along with it into the abyss, into the darkness. I say, F that. F that. Let's rise up and fight and try to take back. Let's try to at least stand for something good and decent and virtuous, even if it's the last thing we do, even if it's completely futile, even if it amounts to nothing at all. Let's be caught doing something halfway redeemable with our lives before it's all said and done. That's my message to you today. That's all I got. Those are the only answers that I have to those hard questions. The real answer to those hard questions is just to keep asking them for yourself in your own life. What can you do? What does Jesus want you to do in your life to somehow make a difference in I would say, quite a dark and quite a wicked world? But it is a world worth fighting for. There are children in this world who deserve us fighting for them so that they can grow up in a world that gives them reason to have a little bit of hope. Okay, thank you so much. I'll leave it there for today. I appreciate you watching and sharing this and subscribing. Take care.